All right. So the cerebral cortex refers to the outermost structure of the brain. So if you were a neurosurgeon and you were going to do a brain surgery, the first thing you likely would see is the cerebral cortex. So you would cut through the various layers of matter uh, between the skull and the head. Then you would remove certain bones, right, from the skull, and that would expose the brain. So that outermost layer is what we refer to as the cerebral cortex. Now, we can describe the cerebral cortex in different ways. We could describe it based on the lobes, or we could describe it based on hemispheres. So if we were to look at the dividing line in between the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain, we would be looking at what's called the longitudinal fissure, and that literally separates left and right brain. So when we talk about hemispheres, we're talking about the two halves of the brain. Now, on one side of the brain, whether it's left or right, it doesn't matter, you still have four lobes. And it almost looks like a backwards C. Now, I'm going to go out of order from the slides, but if we look at the front of the brain, we refer to as the frontal lobe. Immediately behind the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe. In the back of our head, we have the occipital lobe. And by our temples, we have the temporal lobe. Now, that's why I went in the order that I did. And I said I switched the occipital and temporal lobe to make it like a backward C: frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. And there is a nice mnemonic that could help you with it as well. Remember the mnemonic FPOT, right? FPOT will help you remember the four lobes of the cerebral cortex. But that's their position. We also need to know, well, what do they do? So when we think of the frontal lobe or the frontal cortex, we have our decision-making part, which is called the prefrontal cortex. That's literally in the foremost front part, and that's responsible for judgment, decision making, general functioning, and so forth, planning, organization, personality, right? So there was a time where we believed that doing a lobotomy, which in this case we would cut the neurological communication from the prefrontal cortex to lower brain structures, would help with things like schizophrenia and would help with seizures. So they would just cut the connection to the prefrontal cortex. But what they found was it created significant problems with personality. And we know there's a famous case. Now, this was not an intentional lobotomy, but there is a person by the name of Phineas Gage who was working on the railroads when they were building the railroad system. And a rod went through his head and severed the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system and so forth. And all of a sudden, he became a different person. Now, he was the general foreman, so he was in charge of managing what went on when they were building the rail system. And he went from being this organized, cool, calm, collected guy to being a disorganized, uh, angry, irritable, short fused person. Now, when it comes to personality, that typically doesn't happen. So we don't do lobotomies today. That's not our thing. Um, we have other strategies to address schizophrenia and other mood states that are not as invasive. But there was a time this was pretty commonplace. There's a classic film for this one too. If you watch One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is a classic, you see a scene where they reference a lobotomy. Okay, so that's the prefrontal cortex, really your higher order judgment, decision making, executive functioning, however you want to say it. Uh, we also have in the frontal lobe something called the motor cortex. Now, the motor cortex is responsible for sending a message from the brain to the periphery. So there's going to be an impulse that starts at the motor cortex. It's going to go down to the thalamus, down to the medulla, into the spinal cord, and then out to our extremities. And that's going to control our motor functioning. So if I were to ask you to raise your hand, right, the ability to raise your hand properly, you need motor cortex functioning. Now, we also have one more vital part of the frontal lobe or frontal cortex, which is called Broca's area. I'm giving you a lecture, and in order for me to be able to enunciate and speak to you, I need proper functioning of Broca's area. Now, where is Broca's area? Typically, it's on the dominant side of the brain. So for right-handed people, it's on the left side of the brain, right? So that's right-handed people. So we typically say, okay, Broca's area is in the left frontal lobe. However, there's about 50% of left-handed people who share both sides of the brain, right? So Broca's area is on the left side and the right side for some left-handed people. Now, that may seem like a random fact, but it has some value. What is the value? If a person is left-handed and they happen to be one of those individuals who are lucky enough to have both sides of the brain working for Broca's area, then if they had a stroke at some later point in time, they're going to have fewer speech deficits, right? So Broca's area is what allows you to speak or to enunciate. So for some, there's an advantage. Whereas right-handed people, it's clearly defined on the left side of the brain. If you have damage to the left frontal lobe, then you could have damage to Broca's area. Now, I realize I keep just saying the frontal lobe is in the front of the head, but Broca's area is on what's called the orbital gyri. If you were to look at the orbit of the eye, the round part of the eye, and you were to imagine you put your finger in your eye and tapped up, the brain structure that's literally above the eye is Broca's area. Now, why is it called Broca's area? It's named after a person by the name of Paul Broca, who identified this part of the brain and its functioning, which is an interesting point that we name brain structures sometimes based on what they do, sometimes where they are in the brain, and in other times they're named after a major pioneer who figured out what they do, as is the case with Broca's area. Now, the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is immediately behind the frontal lobe. And we have two things that are of importance. Right behind the motor cortex is what we call the somatosensory cortex. Now, if the motor cortex is responsible for sending a message from the brain down to the spinal cord and out to the periphery, we need to have a part of the brain that does the opposite. So the somatosensory cortex is responsible for sending messages of touch, pressure, temperature, and pain from the periphery up to the brain. So it originates in our extremities, goes to our spinal cord, travels up to the medulla, thalamus, and then eventually lands in the parietal cortex or the somatosensory cortex. Now, that is cool. You'll see that the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex are right next to each other. And once again, the phrase things that wire together, fire together. Is it a shock that the messaging from the body to the brain and then from the brain back down to the body are right next to each other? No, right? There's going to be cross communication between the sensory motor cortices, right? Because they work together in tandem and they're right next to each other. The other major part of the parietal lobe is what's called the medial parietal lobule. Now, that is a fancy way of saying the central region, the middle region of the parietal lobe. That's responsible for spatial awareness, our ability to orient ourselves in the world around us, things like being able to take a letter and tilt it to put it in a mailbox. That requires spatial awareness. Now, an interesting finding about the central region of the parietal lobe was that Albert Einstein's medial parietal lobule, or the central region, was about 20% larger than the average person. And you might say, okay, that's once again just some random fact, but it makes sense, doesn't it? Because Albert Einstein was a physicist and he needed the ability to understand how the space and the natural environment work together. And he was responsible for some really important concepts, right? So the concept that time expands through space, that light waves bend. And he demonstrated this through physics. So he needed that region to be functioning properly. Now, whether or not he was born with a larger brain region or brain tissue, or whether it was due to experience, we will never know, right? That nature nurture debate, because Albert Einstein only donated his brain after death. So those people who studied it could only state the finding, but not determine which came first. In other people, we have demonstrated that it's a combination of both, and that shouldn't shock you, that some people are born with a more endowed brain region, and that allows for additional skills. But the ability or using the brain region also results in the enhancement like a muscle, right? So the neurons that are dedicated to that region are going to be larger if you're using it. It's kind of use it or lose it. So it's a combination of the two. Now, the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is the back of the brain. You might hear it referred to as the occiput, is the back of the head. And that's responsible for visual functioning. So the major pioneers here are Yuval and Wiesel. Yuval and Wiesel studied the visual cortex. They won the Nobel Peace Prize for their work on the visual pathway, and they mapped the functioning of vision from the eye to every part of the brain. And they were able to map the functioning of the back of the eye, the retina, and how the neurons work in the retina. And then they moved down the pathway to the thalamus. and they mapped the functioning of the visual pathway in the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, or LGN, and then they mapped it to the occipital lobe, or what we call V1, visual cortex 1, right? So that they did, and what's cool is that they did something that most people would never be able to do, which is publish a series of papers in one shot that they could fill a whole journal. And Yubo and Wiesel, they did, right? They published a series of journals in a special issue that it was just dedicated to their work, which is quite impressive. Now, V1, or visual cortex 1, is also referred to as the striate cortex, also known as striped cortex. And why is it referred to as striate or striped? Because if you look at V1 under a microscope, you have dark region, lighter region, darker region, lighter region, and it almost looks like a 7-layer cake of chocolate and white pound cake, chocolate white pound cake. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it creates a striped appearance that is not the case in the other parts of the brain. So it's distinct in that way. Now, the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is roughly above the ears, so it's on the sides of the head. Now, the temporal lobe has your auditory cortex that allows for you to hear. It also has Wernicke's area. You'll notice W's are pronounced as V's in German, so similar to Wundt. Wernicke's area is the ability for speech and language comprehension. So as I am lecturing, your ability to understand, that occurs in Wernicke's area. Now, the auditory cortex and Wernicke's area are at the highest point of the temporal lobe. So we refer to that as the superior temporal gyrus. However, there are other parts of the temporal lobe that are responsible for things like language, memory, and emotional processing. Now, that should not shock you, because right under the temporal lobe were those limbic structures. And we talked about the hippocampus being responsible for memory, and we talked about the role of the amygdala with emotion functioning and so forth. So again, a third time that we're saying things that wire together, fire together. Those subcortical structures that are right next to the cortical structures oftentimes communicate. So we're seeing how the different parts of the brain communicate with one another. Now, this is a lateral view of the brain. So you're looking at the left side of the brain. And if you could see my cursor, we're going to go through it. Right. So if you see, everything up to this line here is called the frontal lobe. Everything up past the motor cortex and before the temporal lobe. We, as humans and primates, have the largest, in terms of ratio, frontal lobe. And that is valuable because it helps us with like abstract thinking and creativity and judgment, decision making. Now, I said behind the frontal lobe is our somatosensory cortex. Now, if you see my cursor, it's everything from the primate somatosensory cortex back until roughly here. Now, I say roughly here because while certain brain structures have clearly distinct fissures or grooves or what's called sulci, the division between the occipital and parietal lobe is not as clearly defined. So there's something called the angular gyrus here, which kind of divides the occipital, parietal, and temporal lobes. Now, in the back of the brain, you'll see we have what's called the occiput right here, and the occipital lobe, V1, is right about here, and that's responsible for visual processing. Now, if we move into the temporal lobe, I said the superior temporal gyrus is here. That's where our auditory processing or auditory cortex is, as well as Wernicke's area. And then down here, and actually it wraps underneath a little bit as well, is for emotion processing and some other language processing. Now, I didn't point out Broca's area, but if you see where my cursor is here, that's roughly.
카푸나 읽었어.
Leah, your microphone's on.
카플리?
Hang on.
카플리 마직 네바.
Okay. Yeah, so those are our 4 lobes of the cortex. Now, if we were to do a medial view, again, now we could see what's happening on the inside of the brain. And we covered everything, right? So if you look at the spinal cord and the medulla, they're directly connected. Medulla was for vital functioning. Pons, we had those fiber tracts, both ascending and descending. We had the reticular formation happening there. We have the cerebellum in the back, which is for balance and motor coordination. We have our superior and inferior colliculi in the midbrain. We have the thalamus here, hypothalamus here, pituitary here. We talked about all of those. Thalamus is a relay station, hypothalamus responsible for homeostasis, things like food, drink, sex, sleep, etc. Pituitary was for hormones. Now, we talked about everything except for this. Do you see this band in the middle? This is referred to as the corpus callosum, which is responsible for communicating between the hemispheres. So there are 3 structures or fiber tracts that are responsible for communicating across hemispheres. The largest is the corpus callosum. Then we have both the anterior and posterior white commissures, which are smaller fiber tracts. Now, if you were to look at the anterior and posterior white commissure, and if you were to look at the corpus callosum under a microscope, they would look more white than gray. And the question is, why do they look lighter? Why is it more white matter? The answer is simple. If we go back to the previous discussion about a neuron, the axons had myelin sheath on it, right? And that appears lighter. So you're seeing a whiter appearance because of the myelinated axons versus actual cell bodies or soma, they would be a darker appearance. So that is our discussion of the different parts of the brain, what they do, the cortices. Now, I'm going to talk about functioning of the cortex in its own mini video. So let me stop here.